Our next lecturer will be Mr. Christopher Painter. Hi, Chris. Christopher Painter has been on the forefront of cyber policy for nearly 30 years. Serving as a US federal prosecutor, trying high-profile cybercrime cases, and also as a senior official in the US Department of Justice, FBI, and the White House. He was the first cyber diplomat in the United States and also in the world assigned to the cyber coordinator position in the US State Department in 2011. Until 2017, he was the US first cyber coordinator. Among other things, Chris now serves as the president of the Global Forum of Cyber Expertise Foundation. He's on the board of the Center for Internet Security, and he's also an associate fellow at Chatham House. And Chris will talk about the Global Forum of Cybersecurity and the state of cyber capacity building. Please, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Heli, and thank you for both having this session today, or all these sessions today, and your support of these issues over a number of years. First, I'd say that although we're moving to the capacity building section of this discussion, it is not totally divorced in any way from the discussion we just heard on international security, particularly the issues of norms and confidence building measures, because one part of cyber capacity building deals with precisely those issues, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. As Heli mentioned, I had the honor of being the first really dedicated cyber diplomat and really establishing the first office in a foreign ministry that was really dedicated to these issues, not just cybersecurity issues, but the full sweep of cyber issues. As Heli said in the opening, that included things like human rights online, internet governance, other security issues, cybercrime, the whole basket of issues, because there was interdependencies between these. And when I established that new office, capacity building was part of the mandate of that office from the beginning, and that's very important. And you may ask yourself, why? Why is capacity building so important as part of this larger issue, or larger basket of issues of cyber policy, cybersecurity, even cyber diplomacy? And the reason is, as all of you on this call know, or this video conference know, cyberspace is global. The threats are global. The policy is global. And because of this, these issues really cannot be just the province of a few states, as is the case in some other areas of international security. Or really, for that matter, the province of just a few stakeholders. It is a broad discussion that really involves every country in the world at various levels, and really the stakeholders across the gamut, from civil society to industry to academia. So let me give you a couple of examples. Cyber threats. Heli said in her opening that you don't want any country to be the weakest link, and that's certainly true with cyber threats. Before I went and became a diplomat, I was a prosecutor doing cybercrime cases, and if you're a smart cyber criminal, you will route your attacks through different countries because it makes it harder for the authorities to find you, to trace you, and to bring you to justice. If you're a nation state, you see these attacks happen through many different countries or affecting many countries at once. And so they're, by their nature, global. And if you're going to respond to those, and if you're going to either protect against them or respond to them, you need to have a more global approach. The other aspect of this I think is important is that every country is in a position to help every other country. So it may seem to, say, the US that it shouldn't matter if a country has the ability, has a national CERT, for instance, a computer emergency response team, if they have the ability to respond to an incident domestically, why should that matter to the US? Well, it does matter to the US because if those attacks are routed through those countries or even originate in those countries, that country can help the US mitigate the attacks on itself. And that's true for every country around the world. We are interlinked in cyberspace in a way we just aren't in other areas. Cyber policy is the same way. We've talked a lot in the beginning of this series of lectures about a lot of the debates that are happening in the UN, at the Open-Ended Working Group, at the GGE, and at various regional organizations around the world. I used to joke that there are so many cyber summits. It's like the cyber Alps. There are so many different things happening, both intergovernmental discussions and broader discussions with other stakeholders, that you really need to be involved in these discussions, because what happens is decisions that are made in these forums, which may be hundreds or thousands of miles away, will affect your domestic policy, your domestic preparedness, and your domestic ability to both respond to threats and to engage in these discussions. And I think it's also critically important that every state, as I said earlier, gets involved in these discussions and be able to mitigate these threats. So really every country and every stakeholder is important in this. It's just not the province of a few. It's not just the province of the big countries, the developed countries, or even the countries that have a lot of cyber experience. Every country needs to be involved in this. And I think what we find is that, and the reason this was a core pillar of my office when I started it, was cyber security and cyber capacity building is really foundational to all the other pillars we talk about, to the international security pillars, to the internet governance pillars, to the human rights pillars. And we need to make sure that we're advancing that. Now, I mentioned that this was a priority for my office when it started. And indeed, I think it's a priority for many of these diplomatic offices that have been started around the world, and rightly so. One of the things we did early on was we did a regional training, because that was most effective in terms of resources, on various policy issues in the East African community, for the East African community in Nairobi. And this was like right after my office was created, way back now in 2011. And that was very effective, because we not just talked about cybersecurity in that aspect, we also brought into the mix how this would affect human rights online, what the cybercrime aspects are. We made it a more holistic approach. And so that was one of the things we led with, but we did many more of those. And many other countries did this too. And it's not surprising that, I think Kelly mentioned this in the beginning too, that as we go to these international forums, and I mentioned that everyone is talking about cyber issues to some extent, that cyber capacity building has been one of the prime topics of conversation. In some sense, people think it's maybe the low-hanging fruit. In other sense, I think it's something that people tangibly understand. So when you have the open-ended working group meetings in the UN, and I've been to several of those sessions, capacity building features prominently in those discussions. Almost every country raises that issue. Not just developed countries, but many, many developing countries who are now seized with understanding that cyber is a priority issue and focused on this issue. And indeed, I think the COVID-19 crisis that we've seen has highlighted why this is such an issue around the world. Even countries that are less developed and don't have as developed of a digital infrastructure are understanding the dependencies on these infrastructures. And if you're trying to promote your social and economic growth and have that connectivity, which everyone's more and more dependent on in this interconnected world, you need to have good cybersecurity as an underlying aspect. And so that's certainly raised the issue, and it's raised the issue in these UN meetings as well. We also see this happening in diplomatic circles. I mentioned that my office was the first, but certainly not the only. When we started in 2011, we may have been the first, but now there are over 40 countries who in their foreign ministries have dedicated cyber offices, including obviously Estonia, who's hosting this, who's been a real mover and shaker in this area. So what that means is that I think countries are now at a diplomatic level understanding that cybersecurity is more important, and that means that it's more of a policy issue, which means there has to be more attention on how this is done. And part of that is building the internal capacity of countries to deal with this. And I'll raise that in more depth in a moment as well. Another thing I wanted to mention, sort of as a general remark, is that, and Helly mentioned this in the beginning as well, but I really want to emphasize this, is that for too long, I think people have thought of cyber capacity building, or really even cybersecurity, as being a boutique issue, as an issue just for the folks who are seized with these issues to understand. And that's not true. This needs to be a mainstream issue. This needs to be an issue that is the focus of every country in dealing with it. So So as I look at these issues, it is incredibly important for us to seize on these issues, to make sure they're important, and not treat this as an outlier, but a part of our basic economic and social growth. There are three types of capacity building I want to discuss. One is the internal, I'll call it internal capacity building. And by internal, I mean with respect to our diplomatic approach to this. Now, I mentioned creating the cyber office at the State Department, and that was really important. But but one of the things I found in doing that was that as a new area, it was an area that people just didn't understand, that they just didn't deal with, that they hadn't dealt with before. And so it was really important to for us to mainstream that issue within the State Department. So for all the people on the call who are dealing with this issue and are dealing with how we can create this as a foreign policy issue, one of the things you have a challenge of is actually doing that internal capacity building, mainstreaming the issue with your own foreign ministry and within your own government. And that's something that's often difficult, but it's something I think we can look to each other to help build. The second area is diplomacy and policy. I mentioned that in this area, that this is something where there are aspects of policy that are being debated around the world. And that includes norms and Cbms. And I think that's a critically important part of the discussion as we look at this. And the norms and Cbms issue, which was discussed in full earlier on, for instance, one of the products that was produced by the GFC, which I'll discuss in much more length in a few moments, was an overview of current Cbms and how they apply in cyberspace, which could be a good primer for various people. So we have the internal, we have the diplomatic and policy. We have structural, and strategic, which are things like national strategies, making sure that countries have strong national strategies to deal with cybersecurity. I find national strategies are the foundational element of cybersecurity, that they're the key part of a country when they deal with it. If you think about when any country is first approaching these issues, it's important to think about what your overall strategy is. A strategy raises the political level in a country, makes it more of a priority, but also really does a couple of different things. One, it harnesses different stakeholders from across the spectrum, including governments, the private sector, academia, et cetera. Two, it allows a structure to be put forth, a plan for that government to move it forward. And increasingly, all of these national strategies have international aspects, international chapters, which are really critically important. The other kind of structural things we're talking about is building CERTs, building the computer emergency response teams. Those are an important aspect of this, or dealing with cybercrime and cybercrime legislation, including things like the Budapest Convention. So that's a category, the third category of capacity building. The fourth is really technical and skills. And again, this is something that Heli mentioned in her opening. Things like how we actually promote better information sharing, how we promote cooperation between the various aspects of our government within our countries, but also with other governments on issues like cybercrime, on threat reduction, on information sharing with respect to indicators and response. And this also includes skills and education. How do we raise awareness of our population? How do we make sure that skills are taught across the board? So there's a variety of different kinds of capacity building that I think are becoming more important to every country around the world. This is not an area where there's been a paucity of activity. There's been lots of work going on. I want to mention some of it before turning to the GFC. There's been lots of work by almost every developed country and even developing country in this area. The Netherlands has been very active, the US, the UK, Australia, Estonia, the EU, many others. And that's really, I think, important for more countries to make this a priority for their programming, for their capacity building programming. And as Helly mentioned, making this not just this outlier goal, cybersecurity, but also part of the larger development agenda is critically important. This is not just cybersecurity. This is underlying our economic and social growth. So when we think about the UN development goals, this needs to be part of that larger goal. And I think that increases the aperture for even more capacity building around the world, and for this not to be squirreled away as some little corner, but something that's key to our continued success in meeting those development goals for the future for all countries. There's been lots of work by regional organizations. The Organization for American States, for instance, has done a lot of work in their region on capacity building with respect to national strategies and building computer emergency response teams. ASEAN has done good work, including trying to start thinking about how we take the Cbms and norms forward. The Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe has been particularly focused on capacity building with respect to confidence building measures, and I think that's been important. Helly mentioned the EU, and we're going to have more of a presentation on that in a few minutes, and that's been important. The African Union has been focusing on these issues too, as well as a number of regional organizations within Africa. So all of that is critically important, and it's great to see all this different activity, although I'd submit there still needs to be more activity and more focus on this and making this, again, more than just a cyber issue. But one of the challenges that I think that many of us have seen as we've looked at this issue is coordination. I used to joke when I was in government that sometimes the same 3 people in the country were trained by 5 different countries and 4 different international entities in successive weeks. And we don't have a lot of resources to devote this area. So we need to really structure our capacity building so we're doing it in the most efficient, most coordinated way possible. And for that reason, the GFCE was first set up, and it was set up in 2011 by the Dutch government. The GFC is the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. It is an organization of 115 members, including governments, international organizations, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, civil society, technical, and academia. So really across the board of all stakeholders. And it has over 60 countries involved, but all these other stakeholders as well. And it was set up by the Netherlands after they had a big global conference on cyberspace back in 2015 to answer this issue of how do we better coordinate? How do we better make effective worldwide capacity building? Because this is such a key and foundational issue. I should mention, just for folks on this session, you can find more information about the GFC at www.thegfce.org, which has more information and more is being added all the time, and you're welcome to look at that. But this was a critical organization that's grown significantly since it was formed in 2015. And as you see from the slide, and I'm not going to delve in detail on all the information on this slide because I do want to leave some time for questions as we go through, but the basic mission is to fully reap the benefits of ICT through a free, open, peaceful, and secure digital world. So more than just cybersecurity, we need to look at those other aspects, including human rights online, et cetera. And to strengthen cyber capacity and expertise globally by being pragmatic, action-oriented, and a flexible platform for collaboration. That's really what the GFC is. It's a platform to bring all these stakeholders together to really make our capacity building more effective and coordinated. So as we look at the main pillars of activity, the key things are, one, to help coordinate projects. So that's bringing together different parts of the community, through regional meetings, through global meetings, increasingly through online meetings, as we're all doing these days, to get better coordination and information sharing with respect to them. The second key pillar is to help share knowledge and expertise. And, this helps us, both understand what's out there and not reinvent the wheel, because there's so much activity that it's hard to keep track of. So one of the things that the GFC recently did in our last in-person meeting, which was in Africa at the African Union in Addis Ababa, is launch something called the Sybil Portal. And this is a knowledge portal, which is accessible, which it comprises a portal that has all this different information from all over the world in terms of best practices, in terms of other documents, in terms of strategies, a place where people can go to find what they need, to find the information they're looking for, so they don't have to go to multiple places. And even in the few months now, I guess it's been several months since we had our meeting in December when this was launched, there's been significant growth in that portal. I recommend people check that out and help contribute to it. It's been really an important aspect of our work. One of the key aspects, though, of the GFC's work is what we call the clearinghouse function, the matchmaker function. Uh, Often countries don't know where to turn when they need help. Where do they go when they need help with a national strategy? Where do they go when they need help with building a cert or with skills or with awareness raising? It's not really clear. So what we've done is we've set up this way for countries to come and ask the GFC for assistance. And when they do that, there is a process that's begun that involves the other stakeholders in the GFC. So an example of this was Sierra Leone, who came to the GFC asking for help on a national strategy. Again, that's the foundational one, the foundational building blocks of cyber capacity and really cyber security in the country overall. And through a process where there was discussion with Sierra Leone about what they needed, what they wanted, what their processes were, how their government was engaged in this, we assembled a group of different stakeholders from throughout the community, people who could do the general assessment of what this country actually needed, and then help execute the capacity building that be required to do the national strategy, and even how to follow up on that strategy. I mean, one of the things I think has been lacking in this area is having good ways of measuring success over time. And so that's just one example. We've gotten many more requests from countries, and we're trying to make that matchmaking happen, bringing the right stakeholders together with the right resources. And that's a critical part of our efforts that needs to continue. And then the last effort I think is also important, was to fill knowledge gaps. One of the things we've done is have all of our stakeholders look at the field that's out there, see what is missing, what is it that hasn't been produced. You know, sometimes there's multiple products that we can put together and we put on the portal, but often there are areas where there's not really been work and there's not been a focused attention on. So what are those gaps? And then how can we help fill that gap? And so another thing that the GFC launched recently was a global research agenda. And this is doing exactly that, identifying what those gaps are, finding out how we can fill them, how we can get folks to actually do the work to fill those gaps. So all those have been very important. Okay, just going to my next slide. The work of the GFC is done, as I said, by the stakeholders. It is a bottom-up, a member-driven organization, and there's there's an excellent secretariat that helps work all of this, helps make sure that all of these groups are talking together and that the GFC is moving forward. But a lot of the work is done in these working groups, and these are the working groups. And again, I'll hit these at a high level, but leave you the slides so that you can delve into them in more depth. The first one is on cybersecurity policy and strategy. And as I said, those national strategies are often foundational to how we deal with cybersecurity, and how a country does. So that's a key part. But it also includes, very importantly, not just those national strategies and assessments, but CBMs, norms, cyber diplomacy, and international law in cyberspace. All the things we talked about in the first half of this lecture, they're all part of this capacity building effort, because every country needs to be in the game on those. Every country needs to be discussing those issues. Every country needs to know how to create and run and implement a cyber diplomacy program. This I should be clear that we are not trying to duplicate the forums in the UN. We're not trying to negotiate new norms and new CBMs. We're trying to take what's come out of those groups and make sure countries know about them and can implement them and work on them. And so that's been a key aspect recently, not just the strategies, but also those norms. And I mentioned the product on CBMs that I recommend to folks. The second working group is cyber incident management and critical infrastructure protection. And this has a couple aspects. One creating those national cyber incident security response teams. How do you deal with the analogs? How do you deal with cyber exercises and carrying them out? How do you deal with critical information structure protection, which is not just governments, but other stakeholders as well? So that's been a critical one. The third one deals with cybercrime, and that's both on the high level, what laws do we need, like the Budapest Convention, which is the only convention really that deals with cybercrime out there, and has been very effective in garnering more signatures, and that's important. But also, how do you deal with cybercrime training and the more tactical aspects of cooperation between various elements. And so that's been one working group. The fourth one is cybersecurity culture and skills. That's awareness, education and training, workforce development, all key aspects. And finally, one on cybersecurity standards. So all of those have been the real driving forces to identify the gaps, making sure we're identifying the needs. If a country comes in this matchmaking function of C and asks, for instance, for a cybersecurity policy or strategy, we can then make sure that we cross-reference all these other groups and say, well, maybe they also need a CERT, maybe they also need to deal with some cybercrime, that we can be, as much as possible, that one-stop shop that then directs them to the resources they need, which they said, and I'm very happy about this, many more countries are prioritizing and spending resources and doing this. And as Helly also said, the World Bank is turning to this with a cybersecurity fund, which I think will be critically important. So those working groups, I think, have been very effective. We've done a lot of work in promoting those different issues, of following up on those different issues. The working groups are created now just a couple of years ago, but they have really grown in terms of membership and devotion to the people involved in creating various products that are now in the portal. All of those things have been very helpful. We just had our meeting, which was, like many of you, not a in-person meeting, but a virtual meeting over 7 weeks of our members in 35 different sessions to have people contribute and talk about these issues. And as I say, as these become more of a political imperative, and we hear this more in the UN and other forums, we need to be ready to answer this call and make sure that we're doing these different issues. So I want to then just go to my last slide, which is, this is, so cyber capacity building is critically important. It is a part of the ecosystem. It is an underlying foundational aspect of how we can actually make progress in all these different areas, including combating threats, including making sure we're having good policy going forward, and making sure that we have the right people at the various debates on these issues. And the challenge to do this is to create an interlinked and coordinated global network for cyber capacity building. So we don't have this fragmentation. We don't have lots of people doing things without realizing what other people are doing, what resources are there, or how they can coordinate. So, that's the overall challenge. And it's a big challenge, frankly, but it's one that I think we're up to meeting. I've been the fact that the organization, the GFC, has grown substantially over the last number of years has been important. The fact that I mentioned the Dutch created this organization, the government, the Netherlands created this organization, but in the last year, they've spun this organization off to an independent foundation, which I'm very pleased to be the president of the foundation board. But that's really important because now it has independence, so we can draw more resources and more members, and I think that's important. And we need to make sure that we're serving the needs of the community, the country community, and the other stakeholder communities. So that going forward would be critically important too, as part of this larger effort to support capacity building. So as we look at the challenges that I think are subsumed in that, one is to really enlarge the pool of international resources. And part of that goes back to what I said earlier. This can't be seen as this technical issue. This must be seen as a larger political issue and part of a larger development agenda, so that we're not pigeonholing these issues, and the resources devoted to them can be commensurate with what the real needs are. We want to be able to implement the relevant outcomes of the UNGG and the OEWG. Again, that's a link to the earlier part of this discussion. I expect there'll be recommendations and discussion of capacity building. There certainly has been already in the OEWG. I expect that will be in the GG as well. That has happened in prior years, but be able to take that and make sure that we're meeting those needs. We want to also, in recognition of what's going on these days, develop and execute a more robust online training program for cyber capacity building. That will never take the place of in-person meetings and training, but I think it's critically important. And then finally, really strengthen this international coordination is the sine qua non, the whole reason for the GFC to exist. Um, and we want to do that with regional organizations and around the world. So even you have to make sure you're inclusive, and then that's inclusive globally. That means to make sure that countries, whether they be in the Asia Pacific region or in the Americas hemisphere where I am, that all of them are included and that we're making sure we're dealing with all of them and meeting their needs, but also making sure we're including their expertise and resources. So that's something that needs to be important, and we're moving forward with. Additionally, we need to make sure we continue to work on as I mentioned, the global research agenda. That's just beginning. That's something that folks on the call might want to get involved in. I think it's critically important. And the portal to further develop that. So all of those are areas where we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the community, but really being on the leading edge of this. And as I said, it's a critically important area. We welcome more countries and organizations to participate. This is, I think, one of the things that's going to be with us for a long time. We're not going to solve this overnight, but it's going to be part and parcel of everything else you've heard here today. So with that, Helly, I will stop and leave some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Chris, for explaining us what the GFC is doing and what are the challenges for the global capacity building. And I totally agree, we have to really join our forces and make sure that we coordinate and also reach the recipients with the right package that we can help them, actually. So we have received several questions for capacity building lecture, and I'll ask the first one. First question is, why capacity building is important for cyber diplomacy?
So I think when people think of diplomacy, they go, oh, we're just going to go and negotiate things, right? That's what diplomats do. They negotiate things. They go to international meetings. And that's indeed part of cyber diplomacy. It's a core component of it. But capacity building, as I said, really is critical in several ways. One, it allows you to have this collective response against shared threats. So, for instance, I think Jim Lewis mentioned this. One of the aspects is how do you respond to these threats we're seeing every day? And it's more, I think, impactful and actually more effective if countries can do it collectively, if they can band together to do this. I saw this when I was a cyber diplomat, when we saw some activity and we can get other countries to work on this, whether it's for attribution or whether it's for response. But to do that, you actually have to get countries to understand why this is important, to get them involved in discussions of these issues, but also have the capability to assist, to have the actual certain other capabilities. So one of the reasons capacity building from a selfish perspective for countries is important is because it helps them. It helps everyone around the world because you can act collectively. But it's also important for these countries to have the capacity to make sure they can deal with these threats domestically. So it helps, I think, the entire world community, since we're so interlinked, for these countries to have that. And that needs to be something the diplomats are pushing. And if they don't push it, it becomes kind of a fragmented issue. Your law enforcement agencies may be doing some capacity building internationally. Maybe your technical agencies are doing some, or they're members of different groups. And just like in other areas, historically, a lot of these different silos don't talk to each other, and diplomats can bring them together and they, again, elevate this from this technical issue to one of a policy issue and a core national security issue and economic security issue that's part of a country's larger agenda that will help us, I think, respond to these threats and also seize the challenges, make sure that we're making cyberspace safe for all the things that we want to do that are good on cyberspace. Cybersecurity is not an end in itself. It is a road to help us achieve all the good things we want to achieve globally.
Yes, I agree. Second question is about the coordination of the capacity building. What kind of clearinghouse would be required for more efficient coordination of cyber capacity building efforts?
Yeah, so that's exactly, as I mentioned, that was one of the core principles of the GFC is to provide that clearinghouse function. I short name that the matchmaker function. To make sure that we're identifying what the needs are, and we really rely on countries to come forward and ask for help, but we want to also make sure we're aware of countries that need help, and then to put together essentially the consortium of different resources, of different countries, of different not NGOs, of companies who can help them meet that challenge. And it's up to them ultimately. Nothing gets forced on the country. A country can ask, we need help. We present to them the kind of menu of options. We bring together the various stakeholders, and they can work with the stakeholders and make sure it's carried forward. So, it is a way of doing this matchmaking in a way that's most effective for the countries, but also brings more stakeholders together. So for that to work, though, you need to have a good array of stakeholders who can provide those resources, and you need to have a good array of resources in place. So, as I said, our members include many nation states, both on the receiving end of capacity building, but also on the donor end. We have international organizations, including some of the UN international organizations, but many others. We have regional organizations, as I mentioned, like OAS and others. So we have companies, we have civil society groups. We have a pretty broad breadth of people who can help with this in various ways, and then trying to put that together and keep track of it over time. So that's exactly what we're putting together. We've used it a number of times now. We need to build and do that more. We need to scale it up, but that's something that I think is really needed.
And then we have a question about the private sector role. How should we further develop public-private partnership for cyber capacity building, and what is the role of the private sector in the GFC initiatives?
Yeah, the private sector has been a key component in a lot of our initiatives, and so some of it are individual projects that are helped coordinated by the GFC, like doing threat assessments for particular parts of the world. We've had those done. We have a number of private sector entities. I want more. I think we have about 20 now, but I'd like many more from around the world to be part of the organization. Um, Microsoft, Symantec, Palo Alto Networks, many of these companies have been very helpful in different aspects, on some on the norms and Cbms aspects, some on the cert building aspects, some on the infrastructure protection aspects, some on the skills aspects. That's been an important area, for instance, because some of these companies have already been doing some of this work. And I think this is a theme of this presentation really throughout the day, Helly. We can't make this just a government issue. This has to have other stakeholders involved. And capacity building, I think, is really doubles down on that because countries are increasingly having budgets to do this. That's important. Other stakeholders have important perspectives. As countries are developing their economic capabilities in this area, for instance, I mentioned this Nairobi training we did back in 2011 that was for the East African community. They just gotten a major cable drop, so they're getting more internet access. They were dealing with online payment systems like M-Pesa. So they really wanted help in terms of developing their strategy and their policies. And we had private sector players involved in that too. So we can't stovepipe this. We need private sector. We also need academia and civil society. Having that mix is, I think, incredibly powerful. And I haven't seen that in really any other forum where we bring together all these different organizations for the purposes of capacity building. And I think it's been made richer. Now, that said, I want to increase the membership of all those different groups, including the private sector participation. So if you're a company or private sector entity that's interested, let us know.
Thank you so much, Chris, for all of your efforts as a cyber diplomat and now as a global leader for cyber capacity building. Thank you.
Appreciate it. And thank you again for having me here today and putting on this excellent group of sessions. So hope to continue to work with you.